Mary, I'm going to ask you one question. It's a personal question right now. Mary, you're white, and here are 9 Negro students with you. You're from the South. You're from Nashville, Tennessee. Why are you doing this? Why did you become personally involved? Obviously, you've done something that's against the grain. Have you lost many friends?
Yes, but I've gained many more. Why am I doing this? It was in Nashville when I first became aware of what was going on, and I was a college student and saw many other college students fighting for something that, theoretically, regardless of where you're living, you still go to church and the principles are there, supposedly there. I say my Pledge of Allegiance, just like everyone else, and yet I think you have to find a sense of acting. If you have beliefs, you have to have actions, or else you don't have beliefs. And if you don't have beliefs, what are you as a person? And so I found a sense of identity, I suppose, with other college students who were doing something that, all along I had said was right, except, and there always were exceptions and reasons why, perhaps why there shouldn't be integration at the time. And yet when you really look at it, I think, most of the irrational things that are put forth kind of fall apart, and you find yourself as a person and as a personality. And when you kind of look inside you and say, well, what is my responsibility to my beliefs, to my country, as a personality? How do I fit in here? Where do I go?
Mary, one more question. I'm sure many listeners wondering about this. The white people of the South, we see the kids from the University of Mississippi, we see them on the screen, and of course it's incredible. We hear their comments about Meredith. How many are there like you? This is a question, of course, that continually comes up. Lillian Smith was talking about it. Do you feel that you represent something that may be there as yet unexpressed, or are you just an individual alone, or have just a few?
I think especially among college students that there are many who are questioning themselves and the position that has been taken through the years. I think that, first of all, it's very difficult to take a positive stand, and I think there's an increasing number, especially of young people, I say again, in the South, who are not taking a stand, really. They're on neither side of the line, which makes it somewhat better initially.
But as we see these kids on the TV screen, they're in, I think we last know. Mary McCullum, her name. This is several years ago, a round table, Mary the white girl, and 9 of her Negro friends of SNCC. And that was the question asked. Obviously, the Ecclesiastes may be wrong in this case. There is something new under the sun. Something is happening as a result of what these young people are doing. And our guest this morning is Dr. Howard Zinn, who I think is the historian of this particular movement. He has a book called The New Abolitionists, SNCC, published by Beacon Press. Another book simultaneously appeared on the Sheldrake publication of The Southern Mystique. Dr. Zinn was chairman of the history department at Spelman College in Atlanta, which is a Negro girls' college, yes. And now you're a member of the staff of Boston College.
Boston University.
Boston University. And as you listen to Mary talking, I think of your book, The New Abolitionists. You speak of the identity crisis the young people face today and our own identity as a nation.
Yes. Well, I was quoting Erik Erikson. It's a strange thing how you... something you're reading at the moment, you relate it to what you've been thinking about for a long time. And just before I started writing this book on SNCC, I read Erik Erikson's book, Young Man Luther, and he wrote about the identity crisis that young people face, that Luther faced, that other young people face. And, well, you can see it all around you in the country today. And I guess it's true of young people everywhere. They reach a certain age and they ask, well, what am I going to do with my life? And in the United States, the rules are laid down sort of for what you're going to do with your life. You'll go to college, you'll get a good job, you'll get married, you'll get all the little boxes. Some folk song about that, I think. But there's some people who, at this point of identity crisis, take a risk and they move out and they find something wonderful. And I think these kids in SNCC did that. They were touched somehow by something that happened to them, something they saw on a television screen, and they faced that crisis and they came out of it new people, and in the process they're transforming the nation, I think.
This is, as you say, transforming the nation. You refer, the subtitle of your book, The New Abolitionists.
Yes.
We know that in the antebellum period and during the Civil War, the abolitionists were yet there is a difference, isn't there, between what these kids are doing, the circumstances, and the abolitionists of the Civil War period?
Yeah, there are a number of differences. I suppose one of them is that the abolitionists were mainly white. There were a lot of Negro abolitionists who were unknown and working in the movement, but the most famous of the abolitionists and the most influential were white, Garrison and Phillips and the rest. And they worked from the North. They worked from outside, and so they propagandized throughout the nation about what was happening somewhere else. But these abolitionists of today, the kids in SNCC, they're mostly Negro. They're some white. They're not talking at a situation from outside. They move right into the core of it, They have a certain unerring compass which takes them into danger, right into the heart of things. This is why they choose Mississippi, of all places. If they lived in Africa, they'd go to South Africa. There they are, you see. They're like the old abolitionists in that they don't care what people say about the way they act, about how hard they push or how much they cry, about the actions they take. They're impervious to that kind of criticism because they know that they're breaking through some hard shell, and that in breaking through a hard shell, there's always a little trouble and difficulty, and you upset people, but they know this has to be done.
There's something else that impels them, and again, they not only differ from the abolitionists in circumstance, but also from the young, shall we say, radicals and reformers of the 30s who
Yes.
carried political banners. This is something else, isn't it?
Right.
This is not politics. It's something else here.
Right. There's this girl, Jane Stembridge. I was thinking of her when I heard Mary McCollum. There are few white people who attach themselves to this basically Negro movement from the beginning, which was a very good thing because it means that the movement has been integrated from the start. And this girl, Jane Stembridge, talked, about this kind of thing that you were talking about.
She's a girl from Virginia, a white girl from Virginia.
Yeah, she's a girl from Virginia. I think you were looking at what she was saying about this fact of politics, and she says, talking about SNCC, she says, finally it all boils down to human relationships. It has nothing to do finally with governments. It's the question of whether I, and I'm quoting her now, her exact words because I thought she put it just right, said whether I shall go on living in isolation or whether there shall be a we. The student movement is not a cause. It is a collision between this one person and that one person. It is, I am going to sit beside you. Love alone is radical. Political statements are not. Programs are not. Even going to jail is not. And I thought she put it right, just right.
So it is this impulsion, since we have these young white people, Jane Stembridge for one, Mary McCollum for another. There's a boy named Bob Zellner.
Yes.
Now, his involvement, this also involves not only a learning process on the part of young Negroes, too.
Right.
I imagine the bitterness is quite natural, and many can lead to an anti-white, all-around anti-white feeling. But the presence of these does something to the young Negroes involved, too, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. It's an educational process for both. Bob Zellner, a white Southerner, and the first reaction of a Negro to a white Southerner is tension, suspicion, fear, hostility. And then they live with him, they work with him in the most intimate surroundings, and they see him get beaten like them and go to jail with them, and something happens. And the fact of color recedes into the background, and the fact of him as a human being comes forward, which is the same thing that happens to us when we live among Negroes, and then they become human beings and no longer objects, and we're just people, and there are a lot of other important things about us, and color is as important as how tall or short we are.
Oh, this involves your own experience. You speak of a teacher, a fellow teacher of yours, I think a Canadian one, I forget who spoke of, she taught at Spelman and all, there's a complex of Negro colleges in Atlanta, right? Morehouse
it's all called the Atlanta University Center. Morehouse is the men's college, that's where M.L. King went, and Spelman is the women's college.
And as you are there, I suppose it's strange to you at first. You taught there for how many years?
I taught there for 7 years.
7 years.
Yeah.
Now, what happened after you left and went back to Boston, went to Boston University? There's a colleague of yours who speaks of her impression, how pale everyone looked. And your concept of beauty changes too, doesn't it?
Oh, I think I think you're talking perhaps about this white exchange student,
That was it.
a girl named Catherine Cade, who is now in SNCC and in the movement. You know, this is what happens to these people. But she was just a white college girl who came to Spelman College as an exchange student for one semester. Didn't know what she was getting into, what it was like, and well, she lived in a dorm and with Negro girls and went to class with them and so on and so forth. And what was interesting to me was how her whole visual world changed because of this experience she had. After living in a Negro world for a month or so, she was invited out to speak at this lily white college in Atlanta, Agnes Scott College, which very recently became integrated, but at that time it was very white. Invited out to speak because this is the closest you see they could get to having a Negro speaker. They have a white girl who was at a Negro college. They're working their way gradually there. And so they invited her to speak, you know, what are your experiences in the jungle, sort of. And so she told them about her experiences at Spelman College. And then she came back, and she was in our living room that evening. We lived on campus. And she said, it was so strange being there among all of these girls. They looked so different, all of these pale faces and sharp noses. And it was very interesting to me because it indicated how quickly, this was just a month or so, indicated to me how quickly you can change the psychological environment of a person. This is true of Negroes, of whites, of Southerners, of Northerners. I no longer believe in fixed feelings and fixed psychologies. I think people are changeable, very changeable.
You deal on this at length in your second. If we could switch from book to book arbitrarily, your other book is the one book, The New Abolitionists, published, which is the history, really the definitive history of SNCC, and it's more than biographical works. It's a story of the change in a country's feeling. And the other one, that's Beacon, is The Southern Mystique. And I find this a fascinating book published by Knopf. And here you say the mystique is really not a mystique, the mysterious South. And you use the phrase how the hierarchy of values, how people in the South would prefer segregation, but there may be other things they prefer more than that.
Right.
Would you mind dwelling on this just a bit?
Yeah, well, you know, this occurred to me before I moved south. I should say it happened to me, but I didn't know what it meant. And then I thought of it when I spent some time in Atlanta, and I lived in a Negro community, and I had contacts with the white community, and I watched white Southerners behave, and I watched changes in their behavior, and I suddenly realized that as a Northerner, a kind of prejudiced Northerner, in that I was prejudiced against Southern whites, you see, I had something to learn about how people behaved. And I thought back to an incident that occurred to me when I was in the Army, and I was going overseas in World War II. I was in the Air Force. I was a bombardier, but while we were on board ship, they gave us other duties, and so I was put in charge of the dining hall. Segregation. The white soldiers ate at one time, and the Negro soldiers ate at another time in this huge dining room, and I was in charge, big job. And one day there was a great mix-up. Never happens in the Army, of course, but one day there was a great mix-up, and the Negro soldiers came down the gangplanks into the mess hall before the white soldiers had finished eating, and there was no stopping them, of course, and they sat down in whatever empty places there were. First integrated mess hall in the history of the Army, I think.
Accidentally.
Accidentally, right. And I hear somebody calling to me, and it's this white sergeant, Southern accent, saying, Lieutenant, there was a Negro sitting next to me. He says, get this man away from here, you know. And I looked at him, and I was young, lieutenant, not used to pulling my rank, but I sort of said to him, as rankish as I could, you know, you're both going overseas to fight in the same war. It seems to me you could sit together. No, you're just going to have to sit there or nowhere else. I'm not going to move him. And then I looked at his face, this white Southerner's, and I could see the turmoil there. I could see the conflict between all these centuries inside him of prejudice and of feeling. And against those centuries of prejudice, there operated just one little immediate thing, his hunger. He knew it was a long time to the next meal. And I watched this battle, and then he lifted his fork and ate.
And there was the parable.
Yeah, and that, that's told me something, that if people, Southerners, as strong as they feel about the question of race, there are other things they feel even more strongly about, like eating, like having a peaceful life even. Most Southerners don't want to go through turmoil to maintain segregation. There are only a very small number who do. Most white Southerners, and we've seen this pattern, will accept change. They don't like it, they take it grudgingly, but they'll accept it. And once they accept it, then the environment has changed, and then they are going to change gradually.
Well, this, of course, is a most revealing look at it, that it's not ironclad. In your book, Southern Mystique, you speak of the emphasis on history weighing heavy, and the history is good and true, but you're saying there is a certain kind of pressure, the hierarchy of values. In this case, the soldier was hungry, and he knew there'd be 4 or 5 hours for you to eat again. That was more important than the centuries-old bread-in. And I suppose the boycott, economics figures in this too, doesn't it? Say, the department store owner.
Yeah, well, there's, I guess, another example of the hierarchy of values where economic interest comes first. Rich's department store in Atlanta, which was boycotted and picketed for so long by the student movement in Atlanta, by my students standing out there day after day picketing. And Rich's department store finally changed its policy. Now, why? Did they have a sudden moral change in heart? I suppose they claimed they did afterwards. Suddenly they saw how right the new position was. But the fact was they were being hurt economically, losing business. And which came first? And economics and money came first.
It's interesting. They're a great deal, by the way, in both books. They're loaded, serious though they are, loaded with humorous incidents. But the humor is sort of almost zany. The kind of insanity of racism itself.
Well, the Negroes in the South has learned to use humor as, I guess, a relief, a weapon, and everything. Maybe people. I guess I think of the Jews and their humor. Maybe people in tough...
Underground humor, perhaps.
Right. Right. People in troubled circumstances need humor desperately. And I think the best humor comes out of these social situations. And, you were talking about the difference between the kids in SNCC and the old abolitionists. And one of the differences, of course, we don't know how much humor there was in the old abolitionists, but they come down in the history books as kind of grim people. And these kids, of course, are not grim. They're off in a paddy wagon to jail and who knows what, and they wave and they smile. I think this is one of the things that's appealing about them.
I suppose
the stories they tell, they laugh about the terrible things that have happened to them in jail.
Of course, the stories. There's one. It's interesting. You, as a white teacher, in this department store you're talking about, there was this segregated lunch counter. You thought one day the kids came to you said, "Let's crack it," and so you and your wife bought. You asked for 2 cups of coffee and 2 sandwiches.
Kind of looked peculiar.
And then this young couple joined you at the table.
Yeah.
And then what happened? They said they won't serve you. You said, well, we're served already.
Right. It was a strange thing because they had the manager, who was a very nervous white man. He wanted to hold on to his job. He'd been given orders. And this is an interesting thing about white Southerners preserving segregation. Most of them are nervous, and most of the kids are calm. And it tells something, I guess, about the situation. But he was very nervous, and he came over to us, and the 4 of us were sipping our coffee and eating sandwiches and joking and having a great time. And he was so troubled. And he said, this automatic thing, we can't serve you. And, of course, John Gibson, the Negro student with us, said, well, we are already served. And so there was nothing they could do. We sat there, and they closed the counter. They put out the lights. They put chairs on top of the tables. We sat there in a kind of ghost situation for a long time, and then went home. And I think this was the first sit-in at Rich's. It started a long haul.
There are, I say, anecdotes after anecdotes, but all connected, all revealing, some involving theater in Georgia. Rather interesting. So My Fair Lady is now a film, and we know it's a marvelous musical. And My Fair Lady, the story you tell, it's quite hilarious, again indicating hierarchy of values and a bit of the nuttiness involved. Now, would you mind telling the story?
Yeah, about the municipal auditorium.
Yes.
Oh, that was, yeah. The municipal auditorium in Atlanta was segregated. And the kids in the student movement decided to take a crack at it. And they decided to do this by having some of the young Negro actors and actresses in the Atlanta University Center players go down to see My Fair Lady, which was, traveling roadshow, and it was in Atlanta that day, and everybody in town was going to see My Fair Lady. And they sold white tickets and Negro tickets, and if a Negro showed up and got
Very
tickets...
fair lady.
Right, very fair. What we did was a white Southern professor at Spelman College, Georgia born and bred, went down and bought a bunch of tickets. Best seats in the house, right up front, center. And they gave it to him happily, you see. And then he turned them over to the Negro kids in the cast, a beautiful assemblage of people. The director looks like an Othello, and the stage designer, very, very interesting guy named Vess Harper, and a number of the students, actors and actresses, with that flair, I guess, for drama and for
Elegance.
Elegance, right. The way they were impeccably dressed that day. And they went down and they showed their tickets, and everybody got flustered. They had the wrong. And before anybody could do anything, the guy, the nervous guy taking the tickets, had torn them in half, given them the stubs, and they found their own seats while everybody was sort of going into a whirl on what to do with them. And they were approached and told to leave their seats or the show wouldn't go on. And they said, well, very quietly, patiently, we can wait. And the manager got excited, and he went back to the office, and he called up the mayor, Mayor Hartsfield, very white, very Southern, but also liberal and changing through the years, and very wise man. He said, Mayor, here are all these sitting in these seats right up front where everybody can see them. And the mayor said, well, he said, I just have one bit of advice for you. He said, just dim the lights. And then what happened, the mayor had somehow to save his conscience. And the law said, the law-abiding man that he was, the law said there's a Negro section and a white section. So he announced to the press that he had just declared those 6 seats a Negro section. That saved everything.
This is marvelous. Again, how hierarchy of values work. You have another story, again dealing with theater, and this is a boy. It's a Southern white boy, his father from South Carolina,
Right.
who wants to be an actor.
His father was a textile mill owner. How more Southern can you
Now,
get?
what's more, again, weighing values. Now, your college, the college where you taught, Spelman, were doing Finian's Rainbow.
Yes.
With a mixed cast,
Right.
mostly Negro, mixed audience. And there's a marvelous role of Og, the leprechaun. And this boy wanted to do Og very much.
Yeah. He was a wonderful Og, too. He was a very talented
So,
actor.
but doing Og, even though he was raised anti-Negro, segregationist, doing the role of Og was much more important. And he did it. Indeed, there was a love scene with a beautiful young Negro girl there on that stage.
Right.
But again, what is most important?
Yeah.
I think, aren't you hitting on a very strong sociological and psychological truth here that we
I hope
haven't
so.
touched enough?
I think that too many people, this is not only true it's true of historians, it's true of psychologists, and it's true of ordinary people who read historians and psychologists. We have too great a sense of the past. We think things are too fixed, and we think people are too fixed, and we don't realize how quickly people can change under the circumstances, and how history can be tossed aside by just a change in a very immediate and very pressing situation.
Go ahead, you were speaking.
Like the simple scene of a Negro coming into a party and being introduced to a white Southerner who has never met a Negro on this kind of social level of equality before, and he's introduced, and a Negro extends his hand to shake, and a white Southerner who has never shaken a Negro's hand in his life, and there's all the weight of his history and background, and he'd never think of doing it under other circumstances, but everybody around him has shaken hands. And here is the pressure of just this 1 second, and without even thinking, he reaches out and shakes hands for the first time in his life, and a break is made.
Again, the social pressure, status, all this. Again, we think of the Southern staff sergeant in the mess hall on the ship. What is most important? Oh, because you have, again, and also how legally it changes. There's one here, the bus scene in Atlanta in your Southern Mystique. It's after the Supreme Court decision, and a Negro sitting up front, and the woman says, the white woman says, would you please move in the back? He says, well, I have a right to sit here, madam. Haven't you read the papers? She calls the bus driver over. She says, removing the bus driver. She shrugs his shoulders. They call the policeman from the street, and the policeman looks at her, looks at the, and he says to the woman, haven't you read the papers? So I guess it's not. So I guess this word mystique is really the word that we should challenge, shouldn't we?
Yeah, this is the problem. The Negro has been a mystical personality. Some liberals themselves, I think, play on this a little too, and even some Negro writers play on this and make something a little mysterious of the Negro. Segregationists do it, and even liberals do it, and you find when you're living with people and you're doing things with them that it's all nonsense. That the whole Baldwin put it. They think that Baldwin is one of these mystique fellows about race because he does fall into that occasionally. He talks in The Fire Next Time. He talks about the darkness of the Negro and how the white sees death in the darkness of the Negro, or how the white sees sensuality in the darkness of the Negro. But at other times, and I think this is the real and essential Baldwin, at other times he says, and he says it kind of sternly and flatly and no business about it, he says, color is not a human fact, it is a political fact. And I think there he's put his hand on it,
Yes.
There's nothing mystical about it all. We have made it this, and we can unmake it.
Yes.
And the same thing about the Southern white, and the same thing about the South. Nothing mysterious about the South. Southerners behave like people behave.
It's a question then of circumstance,
Right.
Through the years,
Right.
of pressure through the years. You use the phrase, the molding of opinion. Somewhere you think opinion, and you speak of the power of mass media, of politicians, the elite in a sense, I guess because of the power of mass communications.
Mm. Yes, Southern people are like, I guess, people in the American nation totally, very much subject to what other people think. And as their notion changes about what other people think, they are forced to rethink their old values. Television has had a tremendous effect on the South. I don't think we can even begin to imagine what has happened in the minds of people who, whether they like it or not, before you can race across the room to flick the switch, there's a Negro and a white together. You learn things on television. And something is happening through this process of mass communication, and the country is becoming nationalized in a communication sense, and nobody can stop this.
In your last chapter in this book, Southern Mystique, we speak of the South, and you say it really mirrors the nation.
Yeah.
That is, how
Right.
easy it is for the North to be
Yeah.
self-righteous in the matter. Would you mind, because you go way back into history in this, the removal, I didn't realize it, the removal of the anti-slavery clause from the Declaration of Independence.
Yes. Well, my point about the South as a mirror, I think too many of us, in the North particularly, look upon the South as somewhere else. It's behind you. You look at it through a glass, and it's somewhere else, and you can study it, and you can attack it, and you can criticize it. And my point is that, no, it's not a glass through which you look through. It's a mirror in which you see yourself, in which the nation sees itself. It's a crazy mirror. It distorts. It exaggerates all blemishes and all features. But there's nothing in the mirror, in this crazy mirror, that isn't in the original. And every defect which we attribute to the South, racism, this fear of strangers, this provincialism, this conservatism, this false religiosity, which you very often find in the Bible Belt, I think these are national characteristics. They exist in exaggerated form in the South, and so we can look at them and sort of put them aside, but they're national characteristics. The South, in fact, in this sense, the South is very useful to us today because we need to see our faults magnified so that we'll do something about them. And I think we're the kind of nation that we're not sensitive enough. Well, I guess it's true of other nations too, but I know our nation best. We're not sensitive enough. It takes an awful lot of trouble and hurt to make us realize something is wrong. And so things are going along fine, and boom, a crisis. We don't have a social security system until we have 15 million men unemployed. We don't declare the oneness of the nation until part of the nation secedes. We don't begin reading James Baldwin until there's rumbling in the streets and so on. And so we sort of need crises to make us see what we don't ordinarily see because it's there, but it's lying beneath the surface. And so the South is this kind of a situation for us. We can learn a lot from it if we try.
Yes. As you're saying, the switching from the Southern Mystique, your book, to the other book, the SNCC, New Abolitionists, we are learning a great deal through what these young ourselves, through the crisis, but through this new development, this non-violent, active approach on the part of these young who are, apparently they become our conscience in a way, don't they, too?
Yeah, I think that all of us, even the most cool and casual of us, are touched by the phenomenon of there's something very innocent about these young people, and at the same time very wise and very sophisticated. Something very charming and very humorous and yet very serious. And here, too, we see in them some of the problems that beset us. We see in them kids who have made a decision to move away from the ordinary lines of life which most of us follow. And there's a sense of envy and a sense of joy which we can have in seeing this. We can learn from them.
Whence comes this strength? This is the question again. You say there's something new because, as the abolitionists were ethical people of high ethical standards, you know, and meant this ebullience was lacking perhaps because of a puritanical New England background, possibly as a basis.
Maybe so.
But where does the ebullience, the resiliency, the courage that we, not you, because you've been involved, but that many of us up north lack, and I use the phrase rather unconsciously, become our conscience, which certainly is a cop-out on my part in saying that, isn't it? Whence comes this particular... Haven't we been told of a silent generation just
right
10 years ago? You mentioned
silent
this in your book.
and uncommitted.
Yes.
This is, in fact, people were talking this way about all our young people. And then in 1960, I really don't see as many people talking about the uncommitted generation, because how can you? They're the only evidence we have in the country today that there's life and spirit and motion and change. And how did they get it? Where did it come from? Part of it is from youth. I like to think this, because when you're asking, how do people get the way they do? We always do this. We ask, how do people get the way they do? And you think if you will only examine a person's life enough, you can find out why he became the way he did. I have this white Southern friend of mine who is an ardent integrationist. And I've spent hours and hours with him in the past trying to find out, well, what made him the way he did. I've talked to these Negro kids in SNCC and talked to them about their lives, trying to find out what was it about their lives that made them emerge the way they did. And you know what I find? That they didn't live any different lives than anybody else. And what this suggests to me is that we all have the potential to become this kind of person. We all have the possibility of this kind of ebullience, of this kind of youth. We all have the possibility of changing the way we are and changing the way we live. Now, these are ordinary people, ordinary kids, and at some point in their lives, something touched them. And I don't know why, and I can't put my finger on it. A sight, a vision, a voice, an action, I don't know, something touched them, and boom, they were off.
Somewhere in the middle, in the meat of your book of the New Abolitionists, you speak of this one event, you know, the kids at Greensboro decided to sit in, and how different ones who became very integrally part of this, were affected by it in different parts of the country. Negro kids, white kids, each one. And whatever it was, it must have been a different personal note that touched them, but the common chord was there.
Yes. You see it happening. It's true what you said about the sit-ins. You know, there was Bob Moses in New York watching the sit-ins on television, and here he is today, a veteran of the Mississippi Wars. And there was Jim Foreman somewhere else, probably in Chicago, where he once
went to Roosevelt
lived.
University.
Right.
Isn't it, as you say this, you start thinking of these kids everywhere you see on the street. As you say, potentially everyone can be one of these, have this particular, I hate to use the phrase nobility, and yet it is the word, you know, humanness perhaps.
And it can happen just like that. Earlier this summer, there was a hearing in Washington, and a bunch of people came up from Mississippi, mostly Negro, to testify. And there was this 12-year-old kid and sitting up there in the witness stand, a veteran, you see. And I asked him, Paul Goodman was on the interrogating panel, you know, Paul Goodman, very concerned with youth and education and all of that. He was a little staggered. He said, my God, you know, 12 years old, how did you get into this? And the kid says, well, I was just standing on the street, and this demonstration came along, and this cop came along, and he hit me in the stomach, and I went, ooh, and I joined the movement.
It's marvelous. You know, as you say this, there's a marvelous sequence, and I switch now to Southern Mystique, on the Spelman Girl. I think this is very revealing, you know, because you quote Franklin Frazier, who wrote The Black Bourgeoisie, and how the middle-class Negro for years has imitated, emulated, perhaps caricatured unconsciously the white middle-class values. Now, before I ask about the Spelman Girl, now something has happened to the Negro middle class too, hasn't it? It's not away from as it was before, is it?
Away from?
Away from less fortunate, shall we say, as they would put it, Negroes.
Well, I think they're torn. I think this is what happened, because the Negro middle class is caught up in this revolution, too. And one thing about being a Negro, whatever class you are, you can't escape the fact of color and race, although you can try. And so you find a number of middle-class Negroes in the movement. You find in the small towns in the South, it's true, the working people and the farmers come into the churches and crowd into there for the mass rallies, but if there's always a local minister, a local Negro teacher who steps out. It runs across class lines.
But you must talk about Spelman, because this college apparently has for years been known, always emphasized manners and morals. I'm quoting you, the Spelman Girl was for generations the recipient of well-meant advice from her teacher elders. Be nice, be well-mannered and ladylike, don't speak loudly, don't get into trouble. Spelman was pious and sedate, encrusted with traditions of gentility and moderation. And they indeed are this. They are ladies. Could you mind tell us about the Spelman Girl, since you have taught them as chairman of the history department there?
Well, you know, I was a little taken aback by this. You know, I'd never taught in a women's college. And, you know, maybe there's something of this in every women's college, except that, as I said, the South exaggerates everything just a little. And I think any minority group exaggerates everything else, you see. And so Spelman exaggerated what is anyway a characteristic of women's colleges. But what I found was that when the sit-ins began, something happened to these students. They began to change. They began to think differently. They were no longer preoccupied with how to pour tea. They're preoccupied with going down to be on the picket line. This took the hierarchy of the college, you know, the old-time administrators aback, you know, what to do with this. I remember this student of mine. She's now she's not a student of mine anymore. Now she teaches me occasionally. She just graduated from Yale Law School, but she and I were sort of freshmen together at Spelman. I as a teacher, she's a student, a girl from South Carolina, Marion Wright. She's now in Mississippi. She's going to be the first Negro woman lawyer in Mississippi. But a marvelous person. And she was, at this time, involved in a sit-in movement. And as I told you before, we lived on campus. And she came into our living room one day with this petition, which she was going to put up on a dormitory wall. People should sign it to who was going to go down picketing today for her fellow students. And on the top of the petition, she had put this heading, young ladies who can picket, please sign below. And I thought this was such a perfect expression of
tradition.
The past and the present merging.
Because you have that phrase, you know, in the past, it's always been, you can always tell a Spelman girl. You know, the way she walked gracefully, spoke properly, poured tea elegantly, all the attributes of finishing. Today, you say the phrase, you can always tell a Spelman girl, she's always under arrest. Again, isn't it interesting, you speak of changes, how it works with both peoples, with Negro and white.
Yeah.
How this, again, you say history cannot be, even though traditional and rich and full. You mentioned Cash's History of the South, a very marvelous book, and yet that can be overly worked too, can't it, the mystique aspect?
Yeah, because, well, Cash, for instance, makes a good deal of violence in the South. And
it's a marvelous book, of course.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, you know, I happen to disagree with some of the conclusions, but it's the most beautifully written book, and it evokes the sense.
But go ahead, you were saying about Cash's flaw.
But, I want to talk about his flaw, but it's such a good book. But he emphasizes the violence in the South and the other attributes of the South. And this is what I mean by the mystique. He really gets you feeling when you finish this book that there's something about the South which we just can't change. Something strange and mysterious.
John Bartlow Martin said that too, I believe. An excellent reporter from Chicago.
Yeah, right. He said,
I think he too.
He said
had
the
that
Deep
same
South
approach, yes.
says never. You know, the Deep South says never. His point was the Deep South is the Deep South, and you are not going to change it. Well, here we are. This fall, the New York Times, on one page, there were two stories this fall. One was the story that told about in New York, white parents were picketing, objecting to the Negro kids going to white schools. And on the same page, it said, schools in Jackson, Mississippi, peacefully integrated. Well, that's change. And that's not, the South is no longer mysterious.
I suppose what is most ebullient about you, again, you see, I can't help separating you from them, because your whole approach, as the approach of the young here, is one in contrast to what we generally accept today as a hopeless or violence. You see, apparently, in great hope. You seem to. This seems to be the recurring theme in both your works here.
Yeah, I am. I'm optimistic about this, because I look all around and I see these people and I see the way they're working and I see people changing, and I think I've learned that you can't accept surface tensions as the reality, and you can't accept trouble as something to worry about. And all the trouble that we're going through now, which makes people pessimistic, they read the headlines and say, oh, it's terrible, people are rioting and people are demonstrating and people are going to jail and it's just awful. Well, these are birth pangs, and you can't have progress unless you have trouble. And it seems strange, therefore, to be optimistic in the face of this, but that's exactly why I am optimistic, because we're having trouble.
Because the issue, again, let's come back to the early point you made about identity, finding out. Baldwin asks this, and despite the mystical approach, we don't know who we are. And nobody knows my name. They say if you don't know my name, you don't know your own name.
Exactly.
Doesn't it come down again?
Yeah.
So the trouble is then, since we uncover this, we become aware of our unawareness, isn't that it?
Yeah, the nation... We really didn't know ourselves. We didn't know something very important about ourselves until the Negro began demonstrating in the streets. And now we learned something tremendously important, just like I guess we're learning about other things. We didn't learn, it was funny, all the poor people have been with us for a long time. We just learned about poverty. And I guess it's like the maturing of a person. You learn things about yourself. And the real maturity is learning the bad things about yourself. And it's part of growing up. And it doesn't make you worse, it makes you better.
I'm thinking, as you say this, you mention the other aspects, and you speak of our governmental policy, and of course the general impression is, wow, is the government pushing this? And you show that exactly the opposite has been the case. There's been very little, surprisingly, disturbingly little action on the part of the federal government in this matter. And it's quite revealing and quite biting.
There's been a great deal of misinformation, partly spread by the government itself, about its own powers. You remember after the three young people were disappeared in Mississippi, and Attorney General Robert Kennedy came out and Burke Marshall came out and said, well, we're bound, we're limited, there's legal things that get in the way of our protecting people in Mississippi. It's just not true. In fact, they were taken to task by a group of distinguished constitutional lawyers. Mark Howe of the Harvard Law School led the list, and they sent this statement out publicly. In their own quiet academic way, they said to the Justice Department and the government of the United States, that's not so. You do have the legal power to protect civil rights workers in Mississippi. There's an old statute on our books which gives the president the power to use any means he sees fit to protect people's constitutional rights if a state is unable or unwilling to protect them. This power just has not been used.
It hasn't been. It's interesting how, with history indeed moving so fast, so quickly, the misinformation, this is perhaps one of the great perils, is this misinformation. Credit where credit is not due, and credit not given where it is due.
Yes.
And the very fact that the young have done this thing is what has led, I suppose, to whatever developments have happened and whatever reforms have taken place.
Yes.
It's the very thing that people decry.
Yes. you read you read about people being arrested in Macomb. You read about several arrests taking place recently, a few this summer. They wouldn't have taken place if all of this energy hadn't been poured into the summer. And what happens really, the government acts in a kind of minor reaction to some major movement. The Negroes and whites and the civil rights movement pour tremendous tons of energy into the struggle, and it all comes out in little trickles of governmental action.
Coming back to the individual again, that these young people and others like them are not superhuman. You said it's within all of us. The element they fear, they're scared, despite the singing. We haven't talked about the singing movement and the songs they sing continuously. But the fear is there, and yet you mentioned this remarkable young Bob Moses.
Yes.
What, he was going to Yale, is that it? Or
he got his MA at Harvard in philosophy. When you meet him, you can't feel, well, he's a civil rights leader. He's quiet and he doesn't talk much and very modest. You talk to people in Mississippi about Bob Moses, and they talk about him with as much reverence as people talk about Moses in the Old Testament.
I remember this farmer, the voice I heard of Hartman Turnbow of Macomb, Mississippi, saying, Bob Mose. Well, Bob Mose was here. The rest of him, he was here. So he was there, out of the wilderness. Marion Wright, who you talked about, would be the first Negro woman lawyer, speaks of this scene. I think this is very human. I'd been with Bob Moses one evening, and dogs, the police dogs, kept following us down the street. Bob was saying he wasn't used to dogs, and he wasn't brought up around dogs. He was really afraid of them. And then came the march, and the dogs growling, and police pushing us back, and there was Bob, refusing to move back, walking toward the dogs. And somehow the drama that is here, the overwhelming impact, he's scared stiff of these. And yet there is something else, that impelling something else that you say is in each of us.
Yeah, this is, they're not heroes, and they don't have this false bravado. They're scared, and yet they do what they have to do. Last October, I was in Selma, Alabama during Freedom Day, and there was a long line of Negroes waiting to register, and there was Sheriff Jim Clark with his gang, with his their clubs and their guns and their multicolored helmets and their electric prod poles, all up and down the street, as if they were preparing against an invasion from another country. And he wouldn't let the people online leave to get something to eat or to drink or anything, you see. They had to stand there all day long in the hot sun. And he wouldn't let anybody approach them with water or with a sandwich or anything. He said, I ain't going to let you molest these people. Can't bring him any food. And so there were the food carts, which a Negro woman in Selma, Mrs. Boynton, prepared. She then ran for senator. In the movement, people who run for senator also make sandwiches. But she was across the street, and there was all this food. And there were all these guards, and there was Sheriff Jim Clark and his threats. And two young Negro fellows stepped forward. One, Chico Neblett, who went to Southern Illinois University. Another named Avery Williams, who went to Alabama State. And they stepped forward, and they filled their arms with sandwiches, and they walked across the street towards the line. They never reached the line, and they knew they wouldn't reach the line. The troopers descended on them, and they were down on the ground, and the electric prod poles came out, and they were writhing, and they were tossed into police wagons. All of this, incidentally, right in front of the eyes of FBI men and Department of Justice lawyers, said they couldn't do anything about it. But I remember that moment. I was standing about 15 feet away when Chico Neblett took the sandwiches and turned to Avery Williams and said, "Let's go, man."
Let's go, man. Our guest is Howard Zinn, who I'm sure can be described as the historian. Certainly one of the historians, I would say the historian of the freedom movement. Two of his books, one is both equally moving, The New Abolitionists, the story of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, published by Beacon Press, commenting from that, and from his other book, published by Alfred A. Knopf, The Southern Mystique. And we should point out, too, that you're the Alfred Beveridge Award winner for historical writing, too, among other of your attributes, teaching for, 7 years at Spelman,
College.
the Negro Girls' School in Atlanta, and now teaching at Boston University.
University.
A good way to end this. There's so much. We've just brushed the surface of both these books. There's a depth and a profundity, and I say over and above that hope that if you could just perhaps read the last two paragraphs of The Southern Mystique, The South as a Mirror.
Let me go back over my argument. The South is everything its revilers have charged and more than its defenders have claimed. It is racist, violent, hypocritically pious, xenophobic, false in its elevation of women, nationalistic, conservative, and it harbors extreme poverty in the midst of ostentatious wealth. The only point I have to add is that the United States, as a civilization, embodies all of those same qualities. That the South possesses them with more intensity simply makes it easier for the nation to pass off its characteristics to the South, leaving itself innocent and righteous. In any truth which is knotted and complex, we can choose what strand we want to grasp. To pick out the South has the advantage of focusing attention on what is worst, but it has the disadvantage of glossing over the faults of the nation. It is particularly appropriate in this time, when the power of the United States gives it enormous responsibility, to focus our critical faculties on those qualities which mark or disfigure our nation. With this approach, the South becomes not damnable, but marvelously useful, as a mirror in which the nation can see its blemishes magnified, so that it will hurry to correct them. In effective psychotherapy, the patient is at first disturbed by self-recognition, then grateful for the disclosure. It is the first step towards transformation. And in the 1960s, this nation, with its huge potential for good, needs to take another look in the mirror. We owe this to ourselves and to our children.
Howard Zinn, thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed that.